Hello there everybody, my name's Terry, I'm the board modeler, and this is the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor by Italeri in 1:72 scale. This is the kit I'll be reviewing for this video, so let's get the box open, take a look at the parts inside, and then let's get started. First off, sorry for stuff being sort of cut off. This kit's box is so large that I couldn't get it in frame, no matter how much I zoomed out. Anyway, first up is the instruction booklet. Well, when I say booklet, it's more of a cross between a brochure and a scroll in terms of design. While that does make it a bit unwieldy to flick through, especially if you're going backwards and forwards between steps, the diagrams are large and clearly illustrated, and the sub-assemblies are very well explained. Next, we move on to the decals, which provide markings for the first two production Raptors. The decals are well printed, and thankfully there's a reasonable number of them, not too few, but not too many. Now let's move on to the parts in the box, and I have to say, Italeri's done a very good job moulding this kit. The moulding was generally clean, with the parts having almost no flash and very smooth surfaces with a decent amount of detail. Considering that this kit was originally designed in 2000, 5 years before the Raptor even entered service, the detail might not be 100% accurate, and is a bit sparse in areas like the cockpit. Still, the 3 sprues of grey parts do look pretty good to me, and the transparent canopy and head-up display are nice and clear. So, that's this kit all unboxed. How about we move on to something that I can actually fit in frame, and get to building, shall we? We're starting off the build not by assembling the cockpit, but by assembling the ejector seat, which comes in 4 beautifully detailed parts. These parts fit together really well, and the end result was nice and solid, and it looked pretty accurate, as far as I can tell. Once the glue had dried on the ejector seat, I airbrushed it German grey. I also went ahead and airbrushed the rest of the parts I'd need for the cockpit, including the cockpit tub itself. Once the paint was dry, I broke out my set of detail brushes to fill in some of the, well, details. Stuff like the cushions, the seat belts, and the various components and bits of framework on the sides and back of the seat. The level of detail on the seat is excellent, and a small brush and steady hand go a long way towards making it look realistic. Unfortunately, the same thing can't be said for the level of detail in the rest of the cockpit. In fairness to Italeri, the F-22 wasn't even in service when they designed the kit, and many of its details were, and still are, classified. That being said though, I was expecting a bit more detail, especially considering how well the cockpits in other Italeri kits, like the Jaguar and MiG-29, were represented. The moulded in dots and boxes used to represent instrument detail aren't very realistic, but still, they can be made to look pretty good with some careful detail painting. And on the subject of making the relatively sparse detail in this kit's cockpit look good, there's a decal for the instrument panel. Despite the fact that the panel is still flat and featureless, the decal does look pretty good, and it's a lot neater than my detail painting would ever be. With all the individual parts done, I could start final assembly of the cockpit by adding the seat and instrument panel into the cockpit tub. I found it easiest to paint the side stick after attaching it to the model, rather than attempting to paint such a tiny part while it was still attached to the sprue. Overall, I found the cockpit to be a fairly quick and easy assembly, but advanced modelers will want to add more detail for a better looking finished product. Anyway, After airbrushing the top of the fuselage flat black as per the instructions, and then attaching the cockpit subassembly, I moved to the other end of the aircraft and began painting the engine exhausts. Now, on most kits of modern fighters, the exhaust is a simple 1 or 2 piece cone that slides into the back of the fuselage. However, the F-22's complex vectored thrust system makes the exhaust assembly in this kit a little more, shall we say, involved than most other kits. And now that the parts are all painted, I'm ready to start working on it. In theory, the assembly was simple enough. Attach the thrust vectoring nozzles to the upper and lower fuselage halves, then glue in the vertical sections on either side of the nozzles, and finally attach the rear fan section of the engines. Of course, that's how it's supposed to go in theory. In practice, the exhaust turned out to be one of the most complicated parts of the entire build. The thrust vectoring nozzles, which I'm attaching now, seemed a bit too small for the locations they were supposed to go in. That made them really hard to align properly, and because I didn't notice until the glue had dried, my F-22 now has one engine with closed nozzles and one with them slightly open. Whoops. The attachment points for the nozzles caused even more trouble when it came time to attach the sidewalls. Because they were so small, it was easy to break the nozzles off during assembly. That resulted in the exhaust falling in on itself, and required me to hold the assembly in place and completely steady until the glue was fully dry. And once the glue was dry, I had to go back and fill the gaps between the fuselage and sidewalls. To be honest, I can't see why Italeri couldn't have just moulded the sidewalls into the fuselage. It would have probably made the assembly a lot stronger and easier to put together, because as it is, this is a lot of effort to put into an almost invisible part of this plane. But rather than me subjecting you to several minutes of sanding an exhaust, how about we talk about how the F-22 came to be the flagship fighter of the US Air Force. The genesis of the F-22 was the Advanced Tactical Fighter Program, or the ATF program for short. This was a project undertaken by the US Air Force in the 1980s to design an advanced fighter that would replace the F-15 in the 21st century. Several aerospace companies submitted designs, but the two final choices for the program were the YF-22, developed by Lockheed and Boeing, and the YF-23, developed by Northrop and McDonnell Douglas. The two aircraft shared several characteristics, like the ability to cruise at supersonic speed and the use of composite materials, advanced avionics and stealth technology in their designs. However, the two designs followed very different philosophies. The unusual and futuristic-looking YF-23 was focused on speed and stealth, with a maximum speed in excess of Mach 2 and an airframe designed to minimise the aircraft's radar and heat signatures. The YF-22 may have looked more conventional, but that was because Lockheed had designed it with manoeuvrability in mind. Its large tail surfaces and vectored exhaust thrust made the aircraft a fearsome dogfighter, and gave it the edge on pretty much everything else in the sky when it came to close quarters combat. It was these qualities, along with a lower estimated cost, that led to the YF-22 being selected as the top choice in a somewhat controversial decision. Once it had emerged successful in the ATF trials, Lockheed's design formed the basis for the production F-22 Raptor. But seeing as the exhausts are all finished, we'll save that for later in the video. For now though, I'll airbrush the area where the landing gear and weapons bays will attach. And, well, attach them. By the way, the weapons bays fit really well. The main landing gear bays, however, had a gap around the sides. You can't see the gap once they're in place, but knowing that it's there is pretty irritating to me. After the missile bays were securely attached, I added the air intakes. These fit pretty well too, and once they were all attached, I was able to put the main fuselage aside for a bit and work on the nose section. I started off by supergluing some fishing sinkers into the nose to weigh it down. It doesn't actually specify to do this in the instructions, but there's a lot of weight hanging out behind those rear wheels, and I didn't want the aircraft tipping onto its tail once I was all finished. After the superglue had dried, I glued the upper nose and cockpit onto the lower nose section. The two parts fitted together pretty well, and as an added bonus, the Raptor's angular fuselage shape helped to camouflage the seam lines, leaving only a few small gaps which I'll fill later on. First, it's time to combine the completed nose section with the lower fuselage. The large size of these sub-assemblies meant there was a lot of area to apply glue, making the finished product particularly strong. Also, the fit of these components was, once again, excellent. I had to take a break from the fuselage assembly now to assemble the Raptor's flaps. Being separately fitted parts means that they're posable, and the two pieces that went into each flap assembly fitted together pretty well. But I am a bit confused as to why they were moulded as top and bottom halves. I mean, they're not massively detailed components, nor are they particularly complex shapes. So why didn't Italeri just mould them as one piece and make the build process a little bit quicker? Anyway, the flaps are now in place and it's time to attach the upper fuselage. Unfortunately, this wasn't nearly as easy as it sounded. Not only did I have to contend with the complex and fragile exhaust assembly that I mentioned before, but I also found that my kit's fuselage seemed to be a little short at the front. That meant a rather noticeable gap right on top of the aircraft. And that, of course, would need filling. So let's get on to that now, and let's find out how the YF-22 went from prototype plane to frontline fighter. Well, after the conclusion of the ATF program, the YF-22 was developed into the F-22 Raptor. It was intended to be an air superiority and strike fighter, similar to the F-15 that it was planned to replace. The first Raptor, named the Spirit of America, was unveiled in 1991 and made its first flight on September the 7th that year. It, along with the second aircraft, were used for flight testing. The Raptor, now redesignated the F-22 as its development focused on its fighter capabilities, finally entered service in 2003, with 187 aircraft eventually serving across 9 squadrons. At present, the F-22 serves with the United States Air Force all around the world, with squadrons stationed across the United States as well as in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. Originally, it was suggested that countries including Japan and Australia would also operate the Raptor, but owing to the jet's classified technology, it was banned from being sold to non-US customers. In service, the Raptor rapidly earned a reputation as the US Air Force's best air superiority fighter, and consistently emerged victorious in war games and simulated exercises. However, this success came at a cost. The development program ran overtime, and by the time production ended in 2011, it had cost $67 billion to deliver 135 aircraft. This was far more than the original budget of $44 billion for a fleet of 330, and more money than the US Air Force was willing to spend on a fighter with no real opposition. Various plans to reactivate production have been suggested, but the high cost and the success of combat UAVs has meant that none were adopted. At present, though, the F-22 remains one of, if not the, most potent fighter in the world, and is often considered the best manned fighter jet ever to be built. And speaking of building F-22s, I've just finished the sanding and scribing for this model. Well, when I say finished, I mean finished for now, because when I glue the air intakes in place underneath the nose, well, once I got them in place on the bottom, there was a rather substantial gap at the top. Because I'm getting bored of editing montages for every single gap in the model, let's assume that it was filled and sanded, and start gluing the elevators together. Unlike the intakes, the top and bottom halves of each elevator fitted together really well, but I'm not really sure why they were moulded in top and bottom halves to begin with. I mean, pretty much all the 1/72 scale aircraft kits I've built have had one-piece elevators, and given that these elevators are fairly flat, featureless parts, why did they have to be any different? Anyway, that's enough of me complaining about the elevators. Let's put them on the model. And I'm pleased to say that the fit was excellent. Those large locator pins made getting the parts in place literally a snap. While the elevators dry, I assemble the two tail fins. These also come in two parts, but given the way their lower sections curve and flare outwards, I can understand why. After the glue dried, I fitted the tail fins into the fuselage. They fitted pretty well, with only a couple of small gaps around the base of each fin that I had to contend with. And once those were sorted out, I was able to mask up the aircraft and then break out my airbrush and spray on a coat of white primer. On this aircraft, the primer was especially important. That's because the real F-22 has a smooth, stealthy fuselage, so I had to make sure all the filling and sanding I did earlier wouldn't ruin the clean lines of my model. And here we are. Through the magic of editing, I've managed to prime, sand, and reprime the fuselage in the fraction of a second it took for this transition to occur. Now I'm pre-shading the panels by going over all the panel lines with flat black. The idea behind this is to add a shadow effect around the edges of each panel, and break up the vast grey expanse that the fuselage would otherwise be. In my opinion, it looks quite good on the finished model, but it does take quite a while to apply on the F-22, due to the radar deflecting zigzag shape of many panels. With my pre-shading applied and dried, it's time to give this F-22 a coat of colour. Well, if you consider sky grey to be particularly colourful, that is. Anyway, the important thing to remember when applying a colour coat, or a grey coat in this case, to a pre-shaded model is to apply the paint in several light coats rather than one thick one. That way, the shaded panel lines show through the layer of paint on top and create the subtle shadow effect that we're looking for. That tip about keeping the coats light when pre-shading is especially important to remember when you've got multiple colours going on top of each other, as I do here with the Raptor's camouflage. Use light coats and keep the paint thin so you don't accidentally cover up the panel lines and end up with a large featureless blob of grey on an otherwise pre-shaded aircraft. Another thing you've probably noticed is that I'm doing the camouflage freehand. Some of you are probably wondering, Terry, why didn't you mask it? The edges are going to be all fuzzy. Well, on this particular aircraft, that's the effect I'm going for. See, the Raptor's camouflage is called soft-edged camouflage. It means that one colour blends into the other, rather than having a clearly defined hard line. There are ways to mask it off if you're worried about overspray, but I just dial the pressure down a bit lower than usual and go freehand. Maybe it's just me though. Anyway, now that the camouflage is dry, it's time to add a clear coat. Normally, this just protects the paint and provides a smooth surface for the decals to go on, but on this model, the clear coat plays an important role in replicating the Raptor's unique radar-absorbing paint scheme. As you can see in the picture on the top left, the real Raptor varies from a nearly matte finish in shadow to a highly reflective, almost metallic look in direct light. As far as I know, there isn't an exact match for the Raptor's unusual paint finish available commercially. The closest thing I was able to find was this clear silver by Mr. Colour. It's a glossy clear coat with little metallic particles in it, and it's normally used to replicate custom pearlescent paint finishes on scale model cars. After seeing how similar those paint finishes were to the metallic sheen of the F-22, I gave the model a coat of clear silver and, well, I was pleasantly surprised by the results. Admittedly, it doesn't look exactly like an F-22, but the subtle metallic sheen is pretty close to what I've seen in photos. More to the point, it looks a lot better than a standard gloss clear coat, and overall I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. After leaving the clear coat to dry overnight, I found that the surface was a bit rough. So, to smooth everything out and really make it shine, I gave the aircraft a wet sanding with 44 micron sanding film. This smooths out the clear lacquer and gives me a nice uniform surface. Once I had the clear coat all smoothed out, I was ready to start applying decals. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the decal sheet provided with this model strikes a pretty decent balance between looking realistic and not having a ridiculous number of markings to apply. The decals themselves were pretty decent too. Sure, they were a bit on the thick side, but that could be fixed pretty easily by brushing on some setting solution. Because I'm not really a fan of monochromatic grey aircraft, I decided to make my Raptor the first one off the line, which features the colourful Spirit of America graphics on the left side of the nose. This aircraft made the type's first flight on the 7th of September 1997, and continued flight testing until the year 2000, when it was pulled from the flight line to be used for survivability and repair training. Overall, the decal application process for the Raptor was fairly easy. In fact, the only issue I had was with the instructions. For some reason, the instructions in my kit didn't actually show the location of some of the smaller stencil decals, despite calling them out. This might be a bit of a problem if you're a novice builder, but it can be fairly easily fixed by finding a schematic drawing of the Raptor online and using that as a reference. After I'd finished applying the decals, I decided to add some weathering, using oil paints and a stiff brush. The method was fairly simple. Put a few dots of oil paint anywhere that dirt or soot might accumulate or fluids might leak, and using a stiff brush, streak it back in the direction of the airflow. Because the oil paints take a long time to dry, and can be wiped off with enamel thinner without damaging the lacquer-based clear coat underneath, it's fairly easy to make adjustments or remove areas that you're not quite happy with. The most important step, though, is to stop, take a break, and compare the model to your references. It's easy to go overboard and make the aircraft look completely filthy, which, because the F-22 is a fairly new aircraft, we don't really want to do. Oh, one more thing. It's also important to clean off your brush frequently so you don't get paint on areas of the model that are supposed to be clean. Trust me, I learnt that the hard way. Once I was happy with the way my weathering looked, I let it dry overnight and then gave the whole aircraft a semi-gloss clear coat to protect it. And once the clear coat was dry, I removed my masking, flipped the plane over, and painted some of the details in the landing gear and weapons bays. I also gave the bays a black panel line wash to make all the details really stand out. The front and rear walls of the main weapons bay are separately fitted parts, and need to have the struts for the weapons bay doors glued in place before they're attached. The instructions are a bit odd here, because rather than giving you the angle of each strut, they provide the distance between the end of the strut and the end of the wall section. It's hard to get it all aligned correctly, but by using a ruler, I was able to get everything pretty close. Well, close enough for the struts to connect with the doors when I glued them in place, so I'm pretty happy with the way it all turned out. Once the struts were securely glued in place, I added the walls to the weapons bay, and then started work on the landing gear. Well, the landing gear bay doors, because the hinges are separately fitted. This does add detail to the landing gear bays, but considering how hard these parts are to see on the finished model, this is another case where fewer parts would have made for a much faster build. While the glue dried on the doors, I started on the wheels, which also came in 2 parts. Yep, even the nose wheel. All the wheels fitted together well, with only a slight sanding required to get them all smoothed out. But I'm just not sure why they had to be done in 2 halves. Like, don't get me wrong, this kit's actually pretty good, but why are there so many sub-assemblies? It's almost as if they picked a number of parts before designing the kit, and then somehow had to meet that number. Like, the other Italeri kits I've built on this channel have had wheels moulded in 1 piece, and there was nothing wrong with them. I'm not really sure why this kit has 2-piece wheels, to be honest. The parts aren't massive or super detailed or even a particularly complex shape, so, oh hang on, I'd better stop ranting about parts count and go back to the build, or else I'll have finished painting the wheels before I finish complaining about them. Okay, so now that the wheels are done, I'll glue them onto the landing gear legs. There's a couple of extra steps for the nose gear, as, in order to get the wheel in, the lower leg section comes in 2 parts. So, after I glued on the other half of the landing gear leg, and added the landing lights, I was finally ready to glue the landing gear legs into the bays, and for the Raptor to stand on its own 3 wheels. With the gear in place, it was time to put the doors on. In hindsight, I should have done this before I added the landing gear, because, especially with the lower doors in the main wheel bays, I had to sort of slide the door into place between the fuselage and the landing gear leg without knocking off the hinge. The upper main wheel bay doors and the nose wheel bay doors were significantly easier, partly because there was more surface area for me to apply glue on, but mostly because I could actually see what I was doing. Just make sure to check the instructions so that you don't accidentally install the nose wheel doors the wrong way round. It's easy to get them mixed up, because both sides look pretty similar. Well, now that my Raptor's standing firm on its own legs, it's time to give this bird some talons. The Raptor can carry a lot of ordnance, and Italeri's provided what I'm pretty sure is a full combat load. 6 radar-guided AMRAAM missiles, 2 heat-seeking sidewinders, and 2 externally mounted bombs. My Raptor will be carrying an all-missile load, because I think the F-22 looks a bit strange with weapons racks. Anyway, before I attach the missiles, I'll finish painting them. But just painting the missile light grey doesn't quite mean we're done yet. See, the AMRAAM has a couple of different coloured stripes on it, and because this kit's decals don't cover the weapons, I'll have to paint them by hand. Well, sort of by hand. I can't remember exactly where, I think it must have been on a forum or something, but I remember reading a tip about putting a missile in a drill, spinning it at low speed and just holding a paintbrush on it to get a nice straight line. Fortunately, the nose of an AMRAAM turned out to be a near-perfect fit for my motor tool, so I was able to quickly and easily paint all the stripes. And, while the stripes were drying, I glued the tail fins onto the sidewinders. sidewinders were given grey noses, and black control surfaces on the tail fins. Unfortunately, the fins on the nose of the Sidewinder meant that I couldn't fit it in my motor tool, so I used a somewhat more low-tech method to paint the stripes. In other words, I just rolled the missile around the table and held the brush next to it as I did so. Incidentally, the blue stripes are used to designate the missiles as having inert warheads, for use as training weapons or test payloads. Once the missiles were all painted and striped, it was time to attach them to their launching rails. The 6 short hexagonal rails are designed to carry the AMRAAMs, and the 2 taller rails are where the sidewinders get mounted. Just make sure you have them the right way round. The arms extending out are angled back, not forwards as I've done here. Don't worry, I do end up fixing it, after I test fitted the missiles and realised they were pointing towards the tail. Well, once I'd glued all the missiles onto their rails, and re-glued the sidewinders so they were pointing the right way round, I loaded up the Raptor's weapons bays. In my opinion, this Raptor looks pretty menacing with all those missiles hung in its weapons bays, and even more so now that the sidewinders point forwards. Let's leave the model aside for a bit so the glue on the missiles can dry, and start working on the weapons bay doors. The doors over the centre weapons bay are moulded in the closed position, but opening them up is fairly easy. Just cut along the line. Cutting the doors apart may have been easy, but gluing them back in place on the fuselage was a bit trickier. The hinges on the main door section made gluing it in place pretty easy, but the end section that we cut off earlier was a different story. I'd recommend using superglue or something else that sets very quickly for this, because once you get it in position and at the right angle, you're going to want it to set instantly so it doesn't fall off. After I'd finally won my battle with the main weapons bay doors, the doors for the side-mounted sidewinders proved a lot easier. I didn't have to cut anything apart or glue anything in at an awkward angle, and the hinges fitted into place perfectly, making for a nice solid assembly. With all the doors in place, I finished off the underside of the aircraft by adding this antenna, and then it was back to the cockpit to finish off the build. I started out by repainting the head-up display. Now, normally I would actually use clear green paint, but I seem to have run out, so I substituted with a Sharpie. In my opinion, the results look pretty good, and it only took a few seconds to dry. I glued it in place over the instrument panel with white glue, and then turned my attention to retinting the canopy. Italeri did a great job with moulding the canopy. The plastic's smooth and beautifully transparent, but the canopy on the real-life aircraft is tinted dark grey. Fortunately, I don't need to go around looking for another permanent marker because I do actually have paint for this. And once the canopy had been properly tinted, I glued it onto its frame using white glue. The fit was a bit loose, especially at the back, so be careful with it until the glue's dry. I decided to display my Raptor with the canopy open, so after painting the extended hydraulic prop, part 80A, which I then glued to the canopy subassembly. After painting the rear of the canopy frame black, I finished off the build by attaching the completed canopy subassembly to the aircraft. So, build's all done. Have I forgotten anything? Oh, hang on, the masking on the engine exhausts. While I remove that, let's get some ratings done for this kit. So, here's what I thought of Italeri's 1/72 scale kit of the F-22 Raptor. Parts first, and overall I was pretty pleased with them. No flash, clean moulding, and a reasonable amount of detail on most of the parts. But considering the fact that this kit was made back when the Raptor was still classified, some of the detail on the parts is a bit vague and not entirely accurate, and I am still not over the sub-assemblies. In my opinion, quite a few of them, like the wheels and exhausts, could have had fewer parts, and made the build faster, easier and less intimidating for new modelers. For those reasons, I'm giving the parts in this kit a 3.5, because while they're nicely moulded, Italeri might want to think about updating the tooling for a more accurate and less confusing model. I'm also going to give the instructions a 3.5, because while the diagrams were fairly clear for each of the steps, I did spend quite a bit of time flipping back and forth due to the slightly unusual construction sequence. In addition, some of the smaller markings weren't indicated on the decal placement chart for my kit. Overall though, I thought the instructions did a good job of explaining the assembly steps, and with a few changes in order and an updated decal chart, they could be brilliant. Okay, so construction comes next, and I was actually pretty happy with it. Apart from the fact that there were some pretty major gaps left in plain sight, and that the exhaust nozzles lay somewhere between troublesome and impossible, the kit was actually reasonably easy to build. Now that's partly due to the fact that the Raptor's angular shape hid most of the areas where gaps were likely to occur, but mostly because Italeri did a good job designing this kit. Such a good job, in fact, that I'll give them a 4 out of 5 for it. So let's move on to the decals, and another 4 out of 5. The decals included in this kit were well printed and looked good on the model, and thankfully, unlike their MiG-29, Italeri didn't feel the need to reproduce every single stencil as its own separate transfer. The only issues I had with the decals were that they were slightly thick and didn't really conform to panel lines too easily, and that both the colour schemes provided were kind of bland. The first issue isn't really that noticeable on the finished model, and as for the second issue, that's not really Italeri's fault, to be honest. Come on, US Air Force, why don't you make an F-22 Tiger Meat edition? I know it wouldn't be much use in combat, but at least it would look good, right? And finally, value for money. The kit's listed at €18 on Italeri's website, which works out to about $21 in the US and $30 here in Australia. That seems to be a fair price for a kit like this, and even though I bought mine on sale, if I saw this kit advertised at $30 in my local hobby shop, I wouldn't think that too unreasonable. Anyway, once we add all the scores together, we get a solid 19 out of 25, which earns a thumbs up from me, and when we put this kit on the leaderboard, it comes in right on top, in first place. So well done Italeri, for a nice kit of a great aircraft. And thanks to all of you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and maybe even learnt something. If you did, let me know with a like or a comment, and feel free to subscribe if you want to see more reviews and build videos. Anyway, I'm Terry, I've been the Bored Modeler, and I'll see you next time. Stay safe and happy modelling.
F-22 team of Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Pratt & Whitney proudly presents Raptor 01, the Spirit of America.